Well, hello, friends. I hope you're having a great day today. Welcome to Friday's edition of Take 5. We're in the message that I preached on Sunday entitled Next Generation Faith. We should know by now that God has blessed no generation for its own sake only. That's not the reason He does. There is a chain of divine purposes in the history of God's dealings with men. One link joins arm in arm, life in life, faith in faith with another in continuing progression until all of these generations in a united and related capacity present one completed purpose that comes to fruition at the return of Jesus Christ. That's how faith perpetuates from generation to generation. No generation is blessed for its own sake only. We need to do that. God is always blessing one generation, thinking about the next and the next and the next, as far into the future as you and I can even imagine. So let's jump on this today. Let's do verse 7 and 8 before we run out of time today. Verse 7, in this way, every generation will have a living faith in the laws of life and will never forget the faithful ways of God. Every generation must show and tell the next generation of the faithful ways of God. And this is not so that next generation can simply know a good story. This is so that next generation can have an actual personal living experience with God themselves. That is what's so important. The passing of the heritage of faith is supposed to translate into something living and personal and contemporary in the lives of each generation. It's not so they can just tell a story about what mama had or what grandma had. It's not about that. It must translate into something living in their life. As a matter of fact, as we pass this heritage down, it's supposed to nurture a desire for spiritual things so that each succeeding generation can have their own experience of faith and not just have some memory from the good old days. That's never supposed to be just a memory of the good old days. This thing is supposed to progress with God. It's supposed to get better and better, and every generation is supposed to have more knowledge, and every generation is supposed to have a revelation that is beyond what the generation before them, and every generation is supposed to have their own living and personal experience with God. There are entirely too many generations that are basing where they are with God on faith that their parents had or their grandparents had, and they're looking backwards trying to look forward because what was handed down to them has not translated into their own personal experience yet. It is of necessity that every generation have their own experience and own moving of the Holy Spirit in their life. The work of God that transpired in the past is not enough. It will not suffice for this present generation because the life and the circumstances in the present have changed since the last. Let's face it, I'm living in a world that my parents did not live in. My children are going to see things that I did not see. My grandchildren are going to grow up in a world that I did not grow up in. They're going to have their own personal experience with God. So, what I'm passing down to them cannot just be, some stories and fables of the past. What I'm passing down to them has got to translate into their own personal experience with God. And then the last verse of the text said that we do this so that they will not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation whose heart was not steadfast, whose spirit was not faithful to God. The Passion Translation said it like this: by following God's ways, they will break the past bondage of their fickle fathers. Now that word fickle there, it sounds funny, but it has a powerful meaning. It means changing frequently, especially regarding one's loyalties, interests, or affections. Changing frequently, especially regarding your loyalties, your interests, and your affections. It's hard to convince a successor to really receive what you're trying to pass down to them when you're fickle about it. When you're constantly changing about it. I mean, why should they take the hand off of a baton that the generation before hasn't made up their mind whether they want to carry it or not? When you see generations constantly up and down, this week they love God, next week they don't. This week they're on fire and they're wanting to serve in the church and they'd fight hell with a water pistol. And next week you can't get them to come to church. Next week you can't get them to serve. This week they love pastor and he's the best thing since sliced bread. Next week he preaches too long. Next week I can't believe he said that. Next week this. And I'm telling you, constantly up and down and up and down. How in the world do you ever think that we're going to ever convince the next generation that what we have is great and it's awesome and it's worthy of them picking up and pursuing if they constantly see us up and down in our mind and in our loyalties and in our affections concerning it? For the next generation to believe in and earnestly desire what you and I are trying to bequeath to them, they're going to have to know that even at the end of our life, as we get older, we're still persuaded about it, we still embrace it, and we still confess it. That's what it's going to take. We cannot... as we begin to get older, we cannot get fickle about this thing and be up one minute and down the next. And I'm not just picking on a passing generation. My generation is going to have to deal with it as well, because we are the same way even now. Up one minute, down the next, on fire one minute, our wood's wet the next. And at some point along the way, we are going to have to be constant about this thing we call faith and walking with God and serving God if we're going to convince the next generation that it's something that they need to pick up. You know, I experienced some of this in my own life, looking at people that have already gone on to be with the Lord, people that taught me the way, people that showed me the way, people that at one time I wanted to emulate them. I wanted to pursue that relationship and that experience that they had. And then I watched them as they get older. I watched them throw it down and put it aside. I watched them blame other people for things and say, well, I'm not going to go to church anymore. People just don't tell the truth like they used to tell it, or it's not like it used to be. Hey, it doesn't matter what it looks like, friend, as long as it's godly, as long as it's biblical, that's what matters. And even to my dying day, we cannot get fickle about this thing. We've still got to be persuaded of it. We've still got to embrace it. And we've still got to confess it even till our dying day, so that next generation knows that there's something valuable that we have that we're trying to pass down to them. More valuable than money, more valuable than houses and lands and cars, more valuable than possessions and life insurance policies. It's much more valuable than that. And I must ask you today, friend, are you still persuaded? Do you still embrace it? And do you still confess to this next generation that Jesus Christ is the best thing that ever happened to you, and they need to pick this torch up and run with it and pass it to the generation that's going to follow them? Hey, I've got to get out of here. It's been good being with you today. I look forward to being in worship service with you this weekend. Until we gather on Sunday, have a great and safe weekend. And remember, friend, when you trust the Lord, He will never fail you.